Baby found a bear cub trapped in a phone booth. What he did next left everyone in awe. The morning mist hung low between the pine trees, creating a silver veil that made everything look like it belonged in a dream. Michael Hayes drove slowly along the winding forest road, his hands steady on the steering wheel while his wife Jessica sat beside him, humming softly to their 3-year-old son Jacob, who was strapped in his car seat behind them. They had been driving for hours, heading to Jessica's mother's cabin for what was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from the city. The radio had lost signal about 20 minutes ago, leaving them with only the sound of tires on gravel and the occasional bird call from the depths of the forest. Jacob had been unusually quiet, his small face pressed against the window, watching the trees pass by with the kind of intense concentration only children possess. Something about this forest felt different, though Michael couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The air seemed thicker here, not with humidity but with something else, something that made the hair on his arms stand up slightly even though he wasn't cold. Jessica noticed it too, the way she kept glancing at the trees as if expecting to see something emerge from between their dark trunks. She reached over and placed her hand on Michael's knee, a gesture of comfort that told him she felt the strangeness too. They had driven this route before. Many times over the years they'd been married, but today the familiar road seemed to lead somewhere entirely new. The GPS on the dashboard flickered occasionally, the blue dot representing their car jumping around the map as if it couldn't quite figure out where they were. Michael had thought about turning back twice already, but something kept pulling them forward, some invisible thread that seemed to wind through the trees and tug gently at their car. That's when Jacob spoke for the first time in nearly an hour, his small voice cutting through the silence like a bell. "Daddy, there's music," he said, pointing ahead through the windshield. Michael slowed the car even more, straining to hear what his son was talking about. At first, there was nothing, just the usual forest sounds, but then, faintly, he heard it too. It wasn't exactly music, more like a humming, a low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jessica sat up straighter in her seat, her eyes widening as she recognized the sound too. It was beautiful in a way that made your chest ache, like hearing a song from your childhood that you'd forgotten you knew. The road curved sharply ahead, and as they rounded the bend, Michael hit the brakes so suddenly that they all lurched forward against their seatbelts. There, in a small clearing just off the side of the road, stood something that absolutely should not have been there. It was a phone booth, one of those old-fashioned red ones that used to dot street corners decades ago, before everyone had cell phones in their pockets. But this wasn't just any phone booth, this one was glowing, soft pulses of light emanating from within like a heartbeat made visible. The humming was definitely coming from it, growing stronger and more melodic as they sat there staring. Michael turned off the engine without really thinking about it, his hand moving of its own accord. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by that strange, beautiful humming. Jessica was the first to unbuckle her seatbelt, her movements slow and dreamlike. "We should check it out," she whispered, though there was no reason to whisper. Something about the moment demanded reverence, like they had stumbled into a church service already in progress. Michael nodded, reaching back to unbuckle Jacob, who was practically vibrating with excitement in his seat. As they approached the phone booth, and the details became clearer and somehow more impossible. The booth looked ancient and brand new at the same time, its red paint both faded and brilliantly vibrant depending on how the light hit it. Vines had grown up around its base, but they weren't ordinary vines. These ones seemed to pulse with their own inner light, tiny flowers blooming and closing in a rhythm that matched the humming. The door of the booth was slightly ajar, and through the gap they could see the source of the light. Inside the phone booth was a bear cub, but not trapped in any conventional sense. The small creature, probably no more than a few months old, was sitting upright on its haunches, one paw pressed against the phone receiver that dangled from its cord. The cub's eyes were closed, and its mouth was moving as if it was speaking, though no sound came out except for that ethereal humming. The light seemed to be coming from the phone itself, or maybe from the connection between the cub and the device, creating an aura around the small bear that made it look like it was made of starlight. Jessica grabbed Michael's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt, but he barely noticed. His brain was trying to process what he was seeing, running through rational explanations and discarding them just as quickly. This wasn't possible. Phone booths didn't glow. Bear cubs didn't use phones. And yet here they were, witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Jacob, unencumbered by adult skepticism, took a step closer to the booth, his small hand reaching out as if to touch the glowing door. "Wait, buddy," Michael said softly, catching his son's hand gently. But Jacob looked up at him with eyes that seemed suddenly older, wiser than any 3-year-olds should be. "He needs help, Daddy. Can't you hear him asking?" And suddenly, Michael could. Not in words, but in feelings, in images that flashed through his mind like memories that weren't his own. A mother bear, somewhere far away, maybe not even in this world, a connection broken. A child lost between spaces, between realities, trying to phone home in the most literal sense imaginable. The humming grew louder, more urgent, and the light from the phone booth began to flicker. The bear cub's eyes snapped open, and they were the deepest brown Michael had ever seen, filled with an intelligence that was both animal and something more. The cub looked directly at them, and Michael felt a jolt of recognition, though he couldn't say what he was recognizing. This wasn't just a bear. This was something else wearing the shape of a bear, or maybe a bear that had become something else. The distinction didn't seem to matter. Jessica moved first, approaching the booth with slow, careful steps. The cub watched her come, its paw still pressed against the receiver. As she got closer, she could see that the phone's dial was spinning on its own, cycling through numbers that didn't exist on any normal phone. There were symbols mixed in with the digits, shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than human eyes were meant to perceive. The receiver in the cub's paw was crackling with static, but within that static, Jessica could almost make out voices, countless voices speaking in languages that had never been spoken on Earth. "It's trying to make a call," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "But it can't complete the connection." She looked back at Michael and Jacob, her face glowing in the light from the booth. "I think it needs our help." Michael wanted to argue, wanted to suggest they call animal control or the police or someone, anyone, who was equipped to deal with impossible situations. But he knew, deep in his bones, that this was their moment. They had been brought here for this, pulled by that invisible thread through the forest to this exact spot at this exact time. Jacob pulled free from his father's grip and walked right up to the booth, showing no fear at all. The bear cub turned its attention to the child, and something passed between them, a communication that needed no words or sounds. Jacob reached into the booth, his small hand hovering over the phone's dial. The symbols on it rearranged themselves, becoming clearer, more defined. They still weren't numbers or letters from any alphabet Michael knew, but somehow Jacob seemed to understand them perfectly. "He says the path is broken," Jacob announced, his voice carrying an authority that no toddler should possess. "The phone can't find the right place. It's like when we can't find Grandma's house without the GPS, but bigger. The child's explanation was simple, but it made a strange kind of sense. The bear cub made a soft sound, not quite a growl, more like a sigh of relief that someone finally understood. Michael found himself moving forward too, drawn by something he couldn't name. As he approached, he could feel the energy emanating from the booth, making his skin tingle and his thoughts feel lighter, less constrained by logic and reason. The forest around them had gone completely silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the wind had stilled, leaving them in a bubble of perfect calm. The bear cub shifted slightly, making room for the humans to crowd around the phone booth. Up close, Michael could see that the cub's fur wasn't quite right. It seemed to shift and shimmer, showing glimpses of something else underneath, like looking at a 3D image that kept switching between two different pictures. Sometimes it looked solid and real. Other times it seemed to be made of light and shadow, held together by will alone. Jessica reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly, and touched the phone receiver that the cub was holding. The moment her skin made contact with the old plastic, the world exploded with sensation. She could feel the vastness of space, the connections between all living things, the invisible threads that tied reality together. She could sense other worlds, other dimensions, places where the laws of physics were more like suggestions, and magic was as real as gravity. And somewhere in all of that infinity, she could feel what the cub was searching for, a warm presence, patient and loving, waiting on the other end of an impossible phone call. "Oh my God," she breathed, tears streaming down her face. "It's beautiful. It's all so beautiful." Michael reached out to steady her, and when his hand touched her shoulder, he felt it too. The connection jumped between them like electricity, showing him glimpses of realities beyond imagination. He saw forests where the trees sang and cities built from crystallized music. He saw beings of pure energy dancing between stars and creatures that existed in the spaces between seconds. And through it all, he felt the cub's desperate need to return to where it belonged. Jacob, meanwhile, had begun turning the dial on the phone, his small fingers moving with purpose and precision. Each symbol he selected sent a new pulse of light through the booth, and the humming changed pitch, becoming more complex, more layered. It was like he was composing a song, or maybe solving a puzzle that existed in more than 3 dimensions. The bear cub watched him work, its eyes bright with hope. "Almost there," Jacob muttered, concentration creasing his small face. "Just need to find the right there." He turned the dial one final time, and suddenly the static from the receiver cleared. A voice came through, warm and familiar, even though none of them had ever heard it before. It spoke in no language they knew, but they understood it perfectly. It was saying hello. It was saying thank you. It was saying come home. The bear cub made a sound of pure joy, a mixture of a roar and a laugh that shouldn't have been possible for such a small creature. The light from the booth grew brighter, so bright that Michael had to shield his eyes. Through the glare, he could see the cub changing, its form becoming less solid, more ethereal. It was preparing to leave, to go back to wherever it had come from, but it turned to look at them one last time. In that moment, Michael understood everything. The cub hadn't been trapped in the phone booth. It had found it, used it as an anchor point between worlds. But it had been too young, too inexperienced to navigate the complex pathways between realities. It had needed help, and somehow, impossibly, it had called out across dimensions and found them. Or maybe they had found it. Maybe some part of them, some deep, forgotten part that remembered when humans were more connected to the mysteries of the universe, had heard its call and responded. The light grew so bright that they had to close their eyes completely. Michael pulled Jessica and Jacob close, holding his family as reality seemed to bend and flex around them. He could feel the cubs' gratitude washing over them like warm water, along with something else, a gift, maybe, or a blessing. When the light finally faded and they could open their eyes again, the phone booth was still there, but it looked different. Older, more weathered, like it had been sitting in that clearing for decades instead of minutes. The bear cub was gone, but in its place, carved into the wooden floor of the booth, was a symbol. It matched one of the strange figures that had been on the phone dial, glowing faintly with residual energy. Jessica knelt down to touch it, and when she did, she felt a lingering warmth, like the echo of a hug from someone you love. "It made it home," she said, smiling through her tears. "I can feel it. It made it home safely." They stood there for a long time, the three of them, just processing what had happened. The forest slowly came back to life around them, birds resuming their songs, wind rustling through the leaves. But something had changed. The world felt bigger now, fuller of possibility. They had touched something beyond ordinary reality and been changed by it. Jacob seemed the least affected, already tugging on his father's hand, ready to continue their journey to Grandma's house. But even he kept looking back at the phone booth as they walked to their car. "Will we see him again?" Jacob asked as Michael buckled him back into his car seat. Michael looked at his son, then back at the phone booth, which seemed to shimmer slightly in the afternoon sun. "I don't know, buddy. Maybe. The world's full of surprises." Jessica reached back and squeezed Jacob's foot gently. "But we'll remember him, won't we? We'll always remember." As they drove away, Michael watched the phone booth disappear in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the curve of the road and the pressing trees. But he knew it would still be there if they came back. It would always be there, waiting for the next lost soul who needed to phone home. And maybe, just maybe, they would be called to help again. The thought should have been frightening, but instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The rest of the drive to Grandma's house was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that comes after sharing something profound. When they finally arrived, Jessica's mother commented on how radiant they all looked, how peaceful. They just smiled and said the drive had been nice, knowing that no one would believe the truth. Some stories were meant to be held close, treasured like secret gems. That night, as Michael tucked Jacob into bed in the unfamiliar room at Grandma's house, his son looked up at him with those wise eyes. "Daddy, do you think there are more of them? More bears or other animals trying to get home?" Michael sat on the edge of the bed, considering his answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that the world is full of travelers, buddy. Some of them just take different paths than we do, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to help them find their way." Jacob nodded, satisfied with this answer, and closed his eyes. But just before he drifted off to sleep, he whispered, "The phone booth is still calling, Daddy. Can you hear it?" And the thing was, Michael could. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. That beautiful, impossible humming, carrying across miles and dimensions, reminding them that they had been part of something miraculous. In the weeks that followed, they tried to return to normal life. Michael went back to work, Jessica resumed her routine, Jacob returned to preschool. But they were all changed in subtle ways. Michael found himself stopping to really look at things. A spider's web covered in morning dew, the way light filtered through leaves, the patterns clouds made against the sky. he noticed connections he'd never seen before. Synchronicities that suggested the world was far more interwoven than he'd ever imagined. Jessica started painting again, something she hadn't done since college, her canvases filled with swirling colors and impossible geometries, images that seemed to shift and change depending on how you looked at them. She couldn't explain where the inspiration came from, only that it felt like she was remembering something she'd always known, but forgotten. Her paintings began to sell, collectors drawn to something indefinable in them, something that made people stop and stare and wonder. And Jacob seemed to develop an uncanny ability to know when someone needed help. Not in any supernatural way, just a heightened empathy, a sensitivity to the currents of emotion around him. He would walk up to crying children at the park and somehow know exactly what to say to make them feel better. He would bring his teacher flowers on days when she seemed sad. He would curl up next to Michael or Jessica when they were stressed, offering silent comfort that was somehow exactly what they needed. They never spoke about the bear cub and the phone booth to anyone else, but sometimes, late at night, they would talk about it with each other. They would wonder where the cub had come from, what world existed on the other end of that impossible phone call. They would speculate about the phone booth itself. Who had built it? How long had it been there? How many other travelers had used it to find their way home? The questions had no answers, but that was okay. Some mysteries were meant to be savored, not solved. One evening, about a month after their encounter, they were having dinner when Jacob suddenly stopped eating, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Someone else found it," he announced. "Someone else found the phone booth." Michael and Jessica exchanged glances. "How do you know, sweetheart?" Jessica asked gently. Jacob shrugged, returning to his meal. "I just know they needed help too, and someone was there. Someone helped them, like we helped the bear." It was comforting somehow to think that they weren't the only ones, that all over the world, maybe all over many worlds, there were people having encounters like theirs. People being called to help, to witness, to be part of something larger than themselves. It made the world feel less lonely, more connected. It made their own experience feel like part of a vast tapestry of miracles that most people never noticed. Michael started having dreams about the phone booth. In his dreams, it wasn't always in the forest. Sometimes it was on a busy city street corner, and no one noticed it except for one person who desperately needed it. Sometimes it was in a desert, half buried in sand, waiting for centuries for the right moment. Sometimes it was underwater, fish swimming through it, still somehow functioning despite being submerged. In every dream, someone or something was using it to reach across impossible distances, to make connections that shouldn't exist but did. He started writing these dreams down, filling notebook after notebook with stories of the phone booth and its travelers. He didn't know what he would do with them. They felt too personal to share, too strange to explain. But writing them felt important, like he was documenting something that needed to be remembered. Jessica would sometimes read them, adding her own observations, her own dreams. Together, they were creating a mythology of their own experience, a way to hold on to something that might otherwise fade like a dream. 3 months after their encounter, they decided to go back. They didn't talk about it much, just packed up the car one Saturday morning and drove. Jacob seemed to know where they were going without being told, humming happily in his car seat. The drive felt different this time, less mysterious, more like visiting an old friend. They found the spot easily, as if the road wanted them to find it. The phone booth was still there, looking exactly as they'd left it. The symbol on the floor still glowed faintly, and when Jessica touched it, she felt that same warm presence. But the booth was quiet now, no humming, no lights, just an old phone booth in a forest clearing. They spent an hour there, just sitting nearby, feeling peaceful. Jacob gathered flowers and laid them at the booth's entrance, an offering to whatever forces had brought them all together. As they were preparing to leave, an elderly man emerged from the forest path on the other side of the clearing. He walked with a cane, moving slowly but purposefully toward them. When he saw them, he smiled, a knowing smile that made Michael's heart skip a beat. "You've seen it too," the old man said. It wasn't a question. The little bear cub. About 3 months ago? They nodded, too surprised to speak. The old man chuckled. "I helped a fox through. Must have been 40 years ago now. Never forgot it. I come back sometimes, just to check, just to remember." They talked for hours, the old man sharing his story, telling them about the fox that had appeared in the booth during a thunderstorm, crackling with electricity that wasn't quite lightning. He told them about others he'd met over the years, people who'd had their own encounters with the booth. There was a network of them, he said. People who knew about the thin places in the world, the spots where reality was more flexible. They didn't have meetings or websites or anything official. They just knew each other when they met, recognized something in each other's eyes. Before he left, the old man pressed a small stone into Michael's hand. It was smooth and dark, with veins of silver running through it that seemed to move in the light. "From the fox," he said. "It left this behind. I've carried it for 40 years, but I think it's time to pass it on. You'll know when someone else needs it." Then he walked back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if he'd never been there at all. They drove home in contemplative silence, the stone warm in Michael's pocket. That night, Jacob asked if he could hold it, and when Michael placed it in his small hands, it began to glow softly. "It remembers," Jacob said wonderingly. "It remembers all of them, all the ones who've passed through. And somehow, holding the stone, they could feel it too. Echoes of all the beings who'd used the phone booth to find their way home. Life continued, as life does, but with this thread of magic woven through it. They learned to recognize others who'd had similar experiences, a certain look in the eye, a way of pausing when they heard unusual sounds, a tendency to notice things others missed. They never spoke about it directly, but they knew each other. It was like being part of a secret society that had no name, no rules, just a shared understanding that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than most people knew. Sometimes, lying in bed at night, Michael would think about that moment when the bear cub had looked at them with those impossibly deep eyes. He would remember the feeling of touching something beyond ordinary reality, of being trusted with a secret the universe rarely shared. And he would feel grateful, so deeply grateful, that their ordinary drive through the forest had become something extraordinary, that they had been chosen, or had chosen themselves, to be helpers, to be witnesses to wonder. Jessica kept painting, her work becoming more abstract, more unusual. People would stand in front of her canvases and swear they could hear humming or see movement in the corner of their eye. One collector told her that looking at her paintings made him feel like he was remembering dreams he'd forgotten. She just smiled and said art was supposed to make you feel things, but she knew what was really happening. She was painting the connections she'd felt, the invisible threads that tied everything together. She was sharing the gift the bear cub had given them, even if no one else knew that's what it was. And Jacob grew, as children do, but he never lost that sensitivity, that ability to see beyond the surface of things. His teachers called him an old soul, said he had wisdom beyond his years. He helped other children who were struggling, always knowing the right thing to say or do, and sometimes, when no one was looking, he would draw pictures of the bear cub in the phone booth, images that seemed to glow on the page, as if lit from within by memory and magic. One day, when Jacob was 5, he came home from kindergarten with a new friend, a quiet girl named Lily, who had just moved to town. As soon as she walked into their house, Michael knew. It was in her eyes, that look of someone who had seen beyond the veil. At dinner, she mentioned casually that she and her family had seen something strange on their drive to town. An old phone booth in the middle of nowhere, glowing in the twilight. Jacob practically bounced in his seat with excitement, and Michael and Jessica exchanged knowing looks. After dinner, they showed Lily the stone the old man had given them. She held it carefully, her eyes widening as she felt its warmth, its memories. "My mom saw a rabbit," she whispered. "A white rabbit that wasn't really a rabbit. It needed help getting home." They spent the evening sharing stories, Lily's parents joining them, everyone contributing their piece of the puzzle. It was the beginning of a friendship that would last a lifetime, bound by shared wonder. As the years passed, their circle grew slowly. Not everyone who'd encountered the phone booth found each other, but many did, drawn by invisible threads just like the ones that had first pulled Michael's car toward that forest clearing. They became a quiet community of believers, protectors of a secret that wasn't really a secret, just something most people weren't ready to see. They didn't try to convince anyone or prove anything. They just lived their lives with the knowledge that reality was far more flexible than most people believed. Jacob grew into a thoughtful young man who studied physics and philosophy, trying to understand in scientific terms what he'd experienced as a child. He wrote papers about multiple dimensions and quantum entanglement that his professors said were brilliant but unprovable. He didn't mind. He knew that some truths couldn't be measured or tested, only experienced, and he kept drawing, creating art that tried to capture that moment when the ordinary became extraordinary. When Jacob was in college, he called his parents one night, excited and breathless. "I found another one," he said, "another phone booth. This one's in the city, in an alley behind the physics building. And Dad, Mom, there's something in it. Not a bear this time, something else, something that needs help." Michael and Jessica didn't hesitate. They drove through the night to reach him, following that familiar pull that told them they were needed. The creature in this booth was harder to describe. Sometimes it looked like a bird made of light, sometimes like a geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. It was more alien than the bear cub had been, harder to connect with. But Jacob knew what to do. He'd been preparing for this his whole life, in a way. He approached the booth with the same fearless curiosity he'd shown as a toddler, placing his hands on the phone and closing his eyes. This time, the connection was different. Instead of trying to make a call, the being was trying to receive one. It was waiting for instructions, for coordinates, for something to tell it where to go next. Jacob understood intuitively that this wasn't a lost child like the bear cub. This was an explorer, a scout, something that traveled between worlds deliberately, but had gotten stuck in their reality. It needed not just help getting home, but help moving forward to its next destination. Working together, and the three of them managed to establish contact. Michael turned the dial while Jessica held the receiver, and Jacob translated the symbols that appeared in his mind into numbers and directions. It took hours, the night wearing on as they worked, but finally, just as dawn was breaking, they made the connection. The being pulsed with brilliant light, its form solidifying for just a moment into something breathtakingly beautiful, a creature of pure energy and intent, grateful and ancient and utterly alien. Before it departed, it did something unexpected. It reached out with what might have been a wing or an arm or a tendril of light and touched each of them on the forehead. The touch was electric. filling their minds with images of worlds beyond counting, civilizations that rose and fell like waves, the vast network of connections that linked all conscious beings across the universe. It was too much to process, too much to hold, but some of it stuck, adding to their understanding of their place in the cosmic order. When the being was gone and the phone booth stood empty once again, they sat on the ground, exhausted but exhilarated. "It's not just about helping them get home," Jacob said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "It's about maintaining the network, keeping the connections open. The phone booths are like neurons in a vast brain, and we're the synapses helping the signals get through." It was a metaphor, but it felt true. They found out later that similar events had happened all over the world that night. Other phone booths, other helpers, other beings needing assistance. It was like a coordinated migration, or maybe a changing of the guard. The old man they'd met years ago called them, his voice weak but excited. "Did you feel it?" he asked. "The shift? Something big is happening. The worlds are aligning in a new way." He passed away a week later, peaceful in his sleep, but not before passing on more stones. More stories, more connections to the network of those who knew. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. They would get calls, sometimes literally, sometimes just feelings, telling them when they were needed. Not always at the forest phone booth. They discovered there were many such places. Thin spots where reality was permeable. Old buildings, certain trees, abandoned train stations, even a specific bench in a park downtown. Each had its own character, its own type of traveler, its own challenges. Jacob met Savannah at one of these places, a young woman helping what looked like a cat made of shadows find its way back to a world where darkness was light and light was darkness. They bonded over the impossibility of what they were doing, the joy of being part of something so much larger than themselves. They married 2 years later, in the forest clearing by the original phone booth, with a small gathering of people who understood why that location was sacred. When their daughter was born, they named her Hope, and from the earliest age, she showed signs of the gift. She would stare at empty spaces and laugh, reaching for things no one else could see. When she was old enough to talk, she told them about the pretty lights that danced around the phone booth, the singing colors that came to visit. They didn't discourage her or tell her it was imagination. They knew better. The network grew and evolved, adapting to changing times. They started leaving subtle markers for each other, signs that only those who knew would recognize. A specific symbol chalked on a wall near a thin place. A pattern of stones arranged just so. A tune hummed at exactly the right frequency. They were breadcrumbs for the awakened, ways to find each other in the places where help was needed. Michael started teaching, not in any formal way, but sharing what he'd learned with those who were ready to hear it. He would take small groups to the forest phone booth, teaching them how to feel the currents of energy, how to recognize when something was trying to cross over. Most people couldn't do what Jacob couldn't directly interface with the beings, but they could help in other ways. They could maintain the spaces, keep them safe from development or destruction. They could be witnesses, anchors, believers. Jessica's art became internationally renowned, though critics could never quite explain why it affected people so deeply. She knew, though. She was painting the truth of interconnection, the reality that everything and everyone was part of the same vast web of existence. Her paintings were portals in their own way, allowing people to glimpse, even if just for a moment, the greater reality that surrounded them. Years flowed by like water, each bringing new adventures, new beings to help, new understanding of the vast cosmos they were part of. Hope grew up surrounded by magic disguised as ordinary life, thinking it was normal to help interdimensional travelers find their way home. She brought friends into the fold, young people who were more open, less surprised by the existence of other realities. The network was becoming less secret, more accepted, at least among those willing to see. One winter evening, when Hope was 7, she came running into the house, eyes bright with excitement. "Grandpa, Grandma, Dad, Mom, come quick. The phone booth is singing." They all rushed out to the car, driving through swirling snow to reach the forest clearing. Sure enough, the booth was glowing brighter than they'd ever seen it, and music was pouring from it. Not the usual humming, but actual music, complex and beautiful and utterly inhuman. Inside the booth was not one being, but dozens, maybe hundreds, tiny points of light swirling like a galaxy in miniature. They weren't lost or needing help. They were celebrating, dancing, sharing their joy with anyone who could perceive them. It was, they somehow understood, a birth announcement. Somewhere in the vast network of realities, a new world had been born, a new node added to the infinite web of connection. They stood in the snow, the extended family of believers, watching the light show with tears streaming down their faces. It was beautiful beyond words, a reminder that they were part of something magnificent and eternal. The beings danced for hours, and people came from all over, called by dreams or feelings or simple knowledge that something wonderful was happening. By dawn, there were nearly 50 people in the clearing, all watching in silent awe as the universe celebrated itself. When the lights finally faded and the music stopped, everyone stood quietly for a moment, reluctant to break the spell. Then, slowly, they began to talk, to share their stories, to connect with each other. New friendships were formed, new alliances created. The network that had been informal and scattered was becoming something more organized, more purposeful. Not an organization, exactly, but a community with shared purpose. Hope looked up at her grandfather, her young face serious. "This is just the beginning, isn't it, Grandpa? There's going to be more. Lots more." Michael nodded, pulling her close. "I think you're right, sweetheart. The worlds are waking up to each other. The boundaries are getting thinner. And we're here to help with the transition." It should have been frightening. The idea of reality becoming more permeable, but it wasn't. It was exciting, full of possibility. They walked back to the car as a family, leaving footprints in the snow that glowed faintly in the early morning light. Behind them, the phone booth stood silent again, but not empty, never empty. It was a beacon, a lighthouse for travelers between worlds, tended by a growing family of humans who had learned that helping others find their way home was perhaps the most important work in any universe. As they drove home, Hope fell asleep in the back seat, clutching the stone that had been passed down through the generations of helpers. In her dreams, she was flying between stars, following paths of light that connected every living thing to every other living thing. She was part of the network, part of the great web of consciousness that spanned all realities. And even in sleep she smiled, knowing that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The story of the bear cub had become legend in their family, told and retold, each telling adding new layers of meaning. But it was more than just a story. It was a reminder that ordinary people could be part of extraordinary events, that kindness and curiosity could open doors to wonders beyond imagination. It was proof that the universe was not cold and empty, but warm and full of connection, full of beings trying to find their way home, just like everyone else. Michael often thought about that first moment, when they'd rounded the curve and seen the glowing phone booth. How easily they could have driven past, dismissed it as a trick of the light, continued on to Grandma's house without stopping. But they hadn't. They'd stopped, they'd helped, and in doing so, they'd changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless beings across multiple realities. One small act of kindness, rippling out through the cosmos like waves on an infinite ocean. 2 chapters of mentioned part have completed. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new mysteries, new connections, new understanding. The phone booth remained in its clearing, weathering storms and seasons, always ready for the next traveler who needed to make an impossible call. And somewhere, in a reality just slightly out of phase with our own, a bear cub grown into a magnificent creature remembered the family who had helped it find its way home. It remembered, and it was grateful, and, in its own way, it watched over them, ensuring that the network of helpers would continue to grow and thrive. The truth was, everyone was trying to phone home in one way or another. Everyone was searching for connection, for belonging, for their place in the vast tapestry of existence. The phone booth was just a metaphor made literal, a physical manifestation of the universal need to reach out, to connect, to find where we belong. And those who understood this, who had touched the mystery and been changed by it, they became the operators, the ones who helped complete the calls that connected heart to heart across impossible distances. As Michael sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun set through the trees, he felt a deep contentment. His life had been ordinary in so many ways: job, family, house in the suburbs. But threaded through that ordinariness was something magical, something that transformed every moment into a potential miracle. He could hear Jessica inside, painting, humming that strange melody they'd first heard from the phone booth. Jacob and Savannah were in the garden with Hope, teaching her about the plants that grew in the thin places, the ones that existed in multiple realities at once. A car pulled up, unfamiliar, hesitant. A young couple got out, looking confused and slightly frightened. Michael recognized the look immediately. They'd seen something, experienced something that didn't fit their understanding of the world. He stood up, walking toward them with a warm smile. "Let me guess," he said gently. "You found a phone booth where there shouldn't be one." The relief on their faces was immediate and profound. "How did you know?" the woman asked, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Come inside," Michael said, gesturing toward the house. "We have a lot to talk about, and you're going to want to sit down for this." As he led them toward the door, he caught a glimpse of movement in the forest, just for a second, a shape that might have been a bear, watching from between the trees. He smiled and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that would always exist between them. Then he followed the couple inside, ready to add their story to the ever-growing tapestry of wonder that his life had become. The phone booth stood in its clearing, patient and eternal, waiting for the next call. And somewhere, in the spaces between realities, countless beings moved along paths of light, following the network home. The great work continued, tended by ordinary people who had learned that the most extraordinary thing you could do was simply help someone find their way. In the end, that's all any of us are really doing, trying to phone home, trying to find where we belong, trying to connect with something larger than ourselves. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find a phone booth in the forest, glowing with impossible light, and we discover that we're not alone in our journey. We're part of something vast and beautiful and eternal, a network of souls helping each other navigate the infinite mystery of existence. That's the real magic, not the glowing booth or the interdimensional beings, but the simple act of reaching out, of helping, of connecting. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us part of the universal family, all of us just trying to find our way home. The stars came out one by one. each one a distant phone booth, a potential connection to somewhere else, someone else, and in a small house at the edge of a forest, a family that had touched the infinite continued their quiet work, keepers of a secret that wasn't really a secret at all. It was just the truth, waiting patiently for anyone brave enough to pick up the receiver and make the call. The humming continued, soft and eternal, the sound of the universe singing to itself, reminding all who could hear that they were never really alone, never really lost, always just one impossible phone call away from home.